What would happen if Russia and the US went to war? Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in late February, there has been no shortage of ideas and proposals put forward for how the United States should respond. Given the chaotic nature of war, when we think about proposed courses of action, it is imperative that we ask some important, what-if questions to examine what might happen, and not just what we want to happen. What if the United States and NATO imposed a no-fly zone over Ukraine? We've seen continued widespread calls to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. For several weeks the call to close the sky over Ukraine was repeated in every corner of the press and social media. However, it was clear that many people advocating this idea did not stop to think about what such a plan actually involved. A no-fly zone doesn't mean aircraft wouldn't have the ability to fly over Ukraine. Rather, it just declares consequences if aircraft do fly over Ukraine. This edict would require enforcement, meaning American aircraft and pilots flying into harm's way, and could realistically end in death and the war escalating to a wider conflict. Enforcing the no-fly zone would mean Russian and American fighter jets would directly clash, all but guaranteeing wider war. What if the US continues to increase aid and weapons transfers to Ukraine? The White House and Congress have been greenlighting billions of dollars in aid and weapons for Ukraine in its fight against Russia, most recently by fast-tracking $40 billion in aid. The package's intentions, to assist a country in defending its freedom, are noble. Nevertheless, the ramifications for those actions put the US at increasing risk. First, the US is already over $30 trillion in debt with ever-rising inflation. Continuing to pour money into another country's defense will drive our debt even higher and put our economy at further risk at a time when we can't afford it. Second, weapons transfers are damaging our readiness at home. So far, supplying Ukraine has depleted a full third of the entire U.S. stockpile of anti-tank Javelin missiles in about 2 months of fighting, not to mention numerous other military supplies. The more we send, the less we have for our own defense. Third, if the U.S. continues to send money and weapons to Ukraine, Russia has more opportunity to claim the U.S. is acting aggressively and use those transfers as a reason to attack the U.S. or other NATO members. With the tension already high between the US and Russia, our leaders don't need to give Russia an excuse to strike, particularly given our economic challenges. What if Russia attacks a NATO country? What would happen if Russia retaliated against or preemptively attacked bases in NATO countries? Even if American forces were somehow not attacked, the member state struck would swiftly invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which considers an attack on one member as an attack on all. Technically, Congress would have to declare war if Article 5 was invoked, but, whether Congress voted on it or not, the US and its tens of thousands of troops in Europe would almost inevitably become embroiled in a war with Russia if the article was invoked. This war would be truly uncharted waters in multiple ways. The US hasn't had to directly fight a great power since the end of World War II. Combat with Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan isn't comparable in any sense to what combat with Russia would be like. For 2 decades the US military has been engaged in guerrilla warfare with opponents that lack heavy artillery, armored units, or air capabilities. The Russian military would be engaging in combined arms operations and utilizing massed rocket and tube artillery fire that the US military has little first-hand experience with in recent decades. What if the conflict becomes nuclear? Perhaps the most important question is what would happen if war with Russia escalated to the nuclear level. The risk of nuclear escalation is very real, especially if Russia felt backed into a corner. The Russian Federation has almost 5,000 nuclear weapons, and if Vladimir Putin and other Russian elites felt that its very existence as a unified country was under threat and that they had nothing to lose, we could expect them to resort to nuclear weapons rather than be defeated. Russia could likely begin escalation by dropping a tactical or low-yield nuclear weapon onto a Ukrainian city or military formation as a warning to the United States to keep out. Unless cooler heads prevailed, an American response could ultimately lead to a general global nuclear exchange that kills tens of millions and leaves millions more at risk of starvation as global trade, at least temporarily, collapsed. Even if nuclear war was avoided, breaking the nuclear taboo in combat for the first time since 1945 would be a devastating precedent for human history. These risks and considerations are the reality of escalating conflict with Russia. While the world is shocked and appalled by Russia's immoral attacks on Ukraine, U.S. leadership has a responsibility to protect the interests of its own people first and foremost.